In this lab, you configured a VPN connection between two networks with subnets in different regions. Then you verified the VPN connection by pinging VMs in different networks using their internal IP addresses. You configured the VPN gateways and tunnels using the GCP console. However, this approach obfuscated the creation of forwarding rules, which you explored with the command line button in the GCP console. This can help in troubleshooting a configuration. You can stay for a lab walkthrough, but remember that GCP's user interface can change, so your environment might look slightly different. All right, so here I am in the GCP console, and what's special about this lab is that we've already pre-created some resources for you. You can see here under the Resources tab that I have two Compute Engine instances. If you're curious on how this was generated, you can go to the navigation menu, and if we scroll down to Deployment Manager, which we'll learn about later in this course, you'll see that there was a configuration set up here to create this VPN network with a subnet, a firewall rule for SSH, for ICMP, another network with a subnet, SSH, ICMP firewall rule, and then two instances. And if you go in here, you can see all of the different files that were used to create that. So you could actually use those files and automatically create your own infrastructure, or just hang on until we cover that later in the course. Now, the lab instructions start by asking us to review these resources. Specifically, we're going to go to VPC network and look at the networks that were generated. Every network always comes with a default network, so that's already here. And here we see VPN network 1 and VPN network 2, along with its two subnets, one in US Central 1 and the other one in Europe West 1. If I click on firewall rules, we should see the automatic default rules that are generated, and then also the 4 firewall rules that we just created for ICMP and SSH for the two different networks. Now I can also navigate to the instances by going to Compute Engine. And here we see the two different instances. I can collapse this over here. And one thing that's interesting is we can actually add another column so that we can easily see which networks these two instances belong to. So if I click on columns and scroll down here, I can select network. And here we can now see that these actually belong to two different networks. You can actually get more information on the network if we click on NIC 0 here, which is the network interface. We see the network, we see the subnet, we see all the firewall rules, we can see the routes. So you can get a lot more information about the network interface from your Compute Engine instances. So what we want to do now is we want to be able to ping between these two VM instances. And for now, you're only going to be able to do that using the external IP because these are in two separate networks. And once we'll enable Cloud VPN, we'll also be able to ping the internal address. So let's verify that. I'm going to grab the external IP from server 2, and I'm going to SSH into server 1. So let me go in here, and I'm going to use the ping command and ping 3 times that external IP, and we can see that that is successful. And now I'm going to try the same thing, but this time I'm going to enter the internal IP address, which we can see over here is 10.1.3.2. Oops, .3.2. And we're not getting any responses back, and we can wait for this to time out, but this is expected. We should be seeing 100% packet loss because we don't have the VPN connection yet. These are on two separate networks. And there we go, so 100% loss. We can also try the same thing from the other instance. So let me grab the external IP from server 1, SSH there. And we'll repeat the same. We'll first ping the external address. And that works just fine. And then let's try to ping the internal IP address, which is 10.5.4.2. And again, we can see that that's not working. So you might ask, well, why are we doing both of these? For the purposes of lab, the path from subnet A to subnet B is not the same as the path from subnet B to subnet A. And that's what we're verifying that. And we'll do that again once we actually create the VPN gateways. So I can go close this now, and let's actually create the VPN gateways. Now, one thing that's really useful to do when you have a VPN gateway is to actually reserve a static IP address. So first, in going to VPC network through the navigation menu, and we're going to click on external IP addresses, and we want to reserve IP addresses for both of the gateways. You can see that we already have some IP addresses. These are the ephemeral ones of our instances. So I'm going to click on reserve. I give it a name. I want to use IP version 4, and this is going to be in US Central 1. Click reserve. We're going to repeat the same. So this was for network 1, where the subnet is in US Central 1. But for network 2, the subnetwork is in Europe West 1. So we're going to make sure that when we create the second one, we change this to Europe West 1, and then click reserve. Now it's currently saying that these are not being used, so obviously we're going to change that in a second. We're going to go ahead to the navigation menu, and VPN is either under the hybrid connectivity. So here we go to VPN. We want to create a VPN connection. There are two options for the purpose of the lab. We're going to stick with the classic VPN. And then we're going to start off by defining the VPN gateway. So I give it a name, VPN 1. I need to choose the network. So this is network 1. That is in the region US Central 1. I use the IP address. I could also have created that IP address in here, but here it is already, so I can just use that IP address. And then I go create the tunnel. So I'm going to create the tunnel from 1 to 2. And now I need to define the remote IP address. And this is why we pre-created the IP addresses, because here I now need to grab that other IP address. So I'm just going to, in my case, I'm going to open a new tab and just navigate there so that we can copy and paste that IP address. So let me go to VPC network, external IP addresses. And again, this is the remote. So here I need to select that second IP address. So let me grab that, copy that, and place that in here as the remote IP address. Then I also need to have a pre-shared key. In this case, we're just going to use the one from the lab instructions. And I have different routing options. In our case, we're going to go route-based. And then I need to define the remote network IP ranges. And this is just directly from the network, the subnet that we have in that other network. Now, this is great to create this through the console. But if I click here on command line, we get all of the different commands that are being used for that. So you can see we're creating the VPN gateway. It makes sense. But then we're creating all of these forwarding rules and the tunnel. And then we're even creating routes. So again, this is all sort of obfuscated, as I mentioned earlier. But you can get to that information by just clicking on command line. Then we're not going to run this in Cloud Shell. We're still just going to click create. And while this is creating, we can actually go ahead and create the next one. So I'm going to go to the VPN setup wizard. Again, we're using classic VPN, VPN 2. Now I'm going to use the second network that we have. That is going to be in a different region as Europe West 1. I want to grab the IP address from there. We can change the name of the tunnel. It's not really going to affect the functionality, but this is what we have in the lab instructions. Now the remote peer address. Now I need to grab that IP address from VPN 1 static. That's here. So let me copy and paste that in there. The same key as earlier. We're going to go route-based again. And I need to give it more information about the CIDR range of the subnet. So we're going to paste that in there. And now I can click create. And so now we can see here that we have the gateways that are being created. The one is already created. It's creating the other one. I can also look at the tunnels. So you can see that one tunnel is created here. We can see the status. And now we can wait for these to change to established before continuing. So you can see now that the VPN tunnel is established. I actually clicked refresh. So if you're stuck for a while, feel free to just click on refresh and see if that updates it. And now what we're going to do is actually verify the VPN connectivity. So now that this is established, we should be able to ping using the external and internal IP addresses. So let's verify that. We're going to navigate back to Compute Engine, where we have our two instances. And we already know that the external IP address works. So let me just grab the internal IP address of server 2. And then let's SSH to server 1. And in there we'll ping that internal IP address. And there we can see that that is working. So all of the packets were transmitted. And then let's try it also from the other side. I'm going to grab the internal IP of server 1 and go to server 2 and try to ping that as well. And that works as well. And that's the end of the lab.